You're listening to the Truth About Fur podcast, your home for truth about the fur trade in Canada and around the world. The Truth About Fur podcast is a co-production of Blood Origins Canada and the Fur Institute of Canada.
Yeah, over the years, I've had a few guests on various podcasts and stuff that have a name that's rooted kind of in one of the older European cultures or whatever, and it's the same thing. Oh yeah, this is silent, or just ignore this, or it's actually pronounced this way, but everybody says this.
Yeah, there's the North American version. I think the Dutch version is Langelaar, which is the way my parents say it, but I just go by Langelaar or Langelaar. Yeah.
So. Well, there you go. There's the proof of concept.
Exactly.
You've already said this is how Grandma and Grandpa said this is how you're supposed to pronounce it, but we all say it this way.
Exactly. So.
Yeah. That's funny. I'm pretty simple. Hall.
Exactly.
There's no.
Does anyone ever mispronounce that, Mark? That's the real question.
Actually, it drives me nuts because I get self-conscious because I think I have a speech impediment. Because anywhere I go, like some kind of a counter, people like, oh, you know, what's your name? And it's like Mark Hall, and then they write down Paul, Paul, and it's like. No, it's Hall. So that happens a lot. I'm like, do I not speak properly or what?
So while we're on the topic of enunciating names, the best thing that ever happened to me was the movie Frozen, because I respond to anything that starts with an O because nobody knew how to say Olav, right? So,
As someone with a 4-year-old daughter, the movie Frozen is the worst thing that has ever happened.
So I'm hearing.
So we and you know, last names, you know, Doug's, you know,
which is an adventure in and of itself.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the very first time he explained it to me, he said, think of chess, you know, and as opposed to like there's the T, chai, right?
Yeah.
Your chai son.
And I mean, so many people that encounter someone with my last name encounter it with the different spelling, Chai. So they go chase on. Like, you know, people talk about, like, if I had a time machine, here's who I would go back and meet, or here's who I would go back and kill, insert evil person here. If I had a time machine, I would go back in time to find the census taker in 1800s PEI who wrote down my last name wrong and created the Chai spelling that is the source of most of the pronunciation issues that come along with my last name.
Well, the last thing I'll say on this is the only complexity I have is Mark is not even my first name. So
no, I'm one of those too.
I'll leave it at that. It's my third first name. So
third. Okay, you got me beat. Doug is my middle name.
That wasn't by choice. So,
and
anyways, we'll roll into what this show is about, because this is not the Truth About Place and Surnames show. So, if you have a strange pronunciation of your last name, write into us and we will cover it on the show. I would do an episode on trappers' names. Somewhere out there in Canada, there has to be a trapper whose name is Trapper.
Gotta be.
If that's you and you're listening, write in, and Doug will send you an FIC hat.
Absolutely, I will send you a hat if you can show me, like, blank out your actual personal information, but send us a picture of your ID, of your trapping license that says first name Trapper on it.
Because there are hunters whose name is Hunter, like that's a man's name. I've seen that. So, wasn't the fella on MASH
Trapper
the first fella Trapper, right?
Yeah.
Before BJ Honeycutt came into the show. So there you go.
Yeah. Bonus points if your name is Trapper Hunter.
Ooh,
whoa!
Setting a very new
and
standard.
You are a trapper and a hunter, and your middle name is firearm holder, something like that. We're gonna make it really hard to get a hat from
this
Doug.
This is my middle name, responsible law-abiding gun owner.
Yeah. Yeah, there's actually millions and millions of those in Canada. Anyways, we're going to dive into a topic today. Our guest is Olav Langelaar from the BC Trappers Association. So this he's going to fill us in on what the association is up against with Fisher. I did do a podcast with Tim Killey years ago on the Hunter Conservationist podcast when this first came about, trying to learn and understand what's going on. There's been a lot has transpired since then. Olav is the lead person for the BCTA digging into this topic because what the government is saying, the closure of fisher trapping, the data is not matching up to what boots on the ground from members of the association are seeing. So they're looking to chart a a, a path forward, a middle path towards, sustainable trapping and I guess maybe a truer understanding of the actual state of fisher populations in the province. I know I have to deal with them down here when I was sub-trapping on a line down here in the Kootenays. Like there's no fishers down here. I think historically they were never here, but we have to have the fisher exclusion boxes for marten just in case a fisher wanders through and just in case a grizzly bear decides to stick its foot into the box as well. I know that's, I made some. I made some of those boxes. I know there's work groups get together and they pound these things out en masse, get table saws set up or whatever. But I built 4. It took me all freaking day, and at the end of the day, they ended up costing me about $30 to $40 a piece, excluding my labor. So yeah, it's a big deal, and it's maybe Olav, you'll talk a little bit about that. I know there's kind of like pros and cons within the trapping community of whether they're a barrier to big male marten or not. Some say they are, some say they aren't. But anyways, today's show, fishers, British Columbia, what's going on, what the BCTA is doing, and some of the things that they're up against, I think is going to be a theme here. So, Doug, do you want to weigh in on anything before Olav?
No, I mean, I just want to say, I think that this is really a great example of, the disconnect, and a great example of a bad thing, which is the disconnect between government decision makers and what trappers actually see, or hunters or fish harvesters, whoever actually see out there on the ground. And, the work that BCTA has done on this is an incredible example of kind of on the ground science, as opposed to just like, here's a tabletop exercise somewhere. This is bringing in the experiences of dozens, hundreds of trappers across BC to help inform government and provide them with better information to make better decisions about. And unfortunately, it seems as though that hasn't necessarily panned out. The government hasn't necessarily held up their end of the bargain, which is unfortunate, because all that does is breed, cynicism and skepticism amongst trappers. It's something that would be really great if we could see more examples of governments, deferring to or listening to trappers in what's going on the landscape, instead of, sitting in an office building somewhere making decisions without actually talking to anybody that it actually affects.
Okay, awesome. Olav, everybody, Olav, our guest on this show. So take it over from here. Take the mic over, and tell us the story.
Sure.
Whatever starting point you want to start at, and walk folks through what's going on.
Okay, so look, all the comments you guys have made are very true and valid. So I got involved in this about 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And what led me to take this project on was the fact that I'd heard of this original red listing in 2003. It was almost immediately reversed on account of bad science and bad data. And back then, the bad data was the government relied on trapper harvest data, which we know is not representative of what goes on the landscape, because particularly in the regions they were studying, most of the trap lines were not being utilized. And the trapper at the time was the president of the BCTA, Bob, and Bob said, wait a minute, there's a reason they're only being harvested here, because that's my trap line, and no one's trapping within 100 kilometers of me. So there was this, it was identified very quickly that the use of harvest data was inaccurate because they weren't being harvested. And the government used that as a proxy for, well, there are no fishers within 200 kilometers of you. No, nobody was trapping. Fast forward to about 5-6 years ago, a subsequent paper came out. I had just joined the BCTA. I trapped through Ontario, Manitoba as a kid. I picked up a trap line here about 3-4 years ago, and I watched this presentation by one of the biologists, and I thought, boy, mathematically, this is not defensible. And just by way of background, I've got a long history of financial and modeling. I work in the mining sector. We do resource estimations. So I'm pretty familiar with a lot of how this works. And the one thing I tell people is when you got your Excel sheet, the only thing I can tell you is it's wrong. So what it is, you treat it as an organism and you say, okay, what if I change this? What if I change? Give me a range. What could the population be? And when we received the original CDC listing, the estimate was 299 to 517 male fishers, which I thought was a pretty exact number. What became abundantly clear was that the area of occupancy was sort of 47,000 square kilometers, yet our top 5 harvest areas was over 97,000 kilometers. So like you say they're in 47, we're catching them over 97. There's a disconnect there. As things evolved, I started trapping. I picked up a trap line that had been dormant for 20 years. The government said there were no fishers on my line, and I caught 6 in 3 weeks over 10 kilometers of road, which if I drew a polygon was 30 square kilometers, which is a staggering number. And I said, wait a minute, I just caught 3 or 5% of the entire Colombian fisher population in 3 weeks. How is this even possible? So that's how I got involved in the program and started sort of taking up the fight, so to speak. We then embarked on a process where we thought, well, look, my view always has been BC trappers, we're the managers of all fur bearers in the province. We have a greater reach. We have more membership with boots on the ground, not just during trapping season. We're all on our trap lines during the summers, during hunting season. Like we have a pretty good feel for what's going on and a very intimate knowledge of our trap lines. I compare that to a BC government biologist who is scraping around for funding, tries to get a 2-week program in the field. And as we know, we probably spend more time in one season than most biologists spend in their lifetime on the ground. So we were, we were trying to decide how to proceed, and then we had a memo sent to us by Waterlands Resource Stewardship, which was rather draconian in terms of you guys are wiping out the fishers. We want to ban like 220s. We want to ban 330s. And the rules were just staggering. And so at that point, Tim, Glenn, and I said, okay, we got to go to Victoria and we got to find out what's going on. And the genesis of that whole memo was a paper written by a master's student as a project. And look, no offense to academics, but this was a project paper, not a scientifically defensible piece of work. And I think it was really an exercise for this student to use modeling software. So we inputted all of this data, and he said that fishers are going to be extinct in BC in 9.2 years. Unfortunately, apparently the data was about 10 years old, which meant they shouldn't be around, and yet we still have fishers. So that was sort of the kickoff in the background to how we got involved in this program. And then there was I think it was a genuinely honest attempt to work together with the government. And I always had this view that government is strapped for resources on both financially, people, et cetera, et cetera. But the BC trappers we're a helpful lot. Like we all work together. You see the informal help we have, which is like an industry, I think, second to none. We're not like hunters that don't want to disclose their secret honey hole. We share methods, we share data, we share information. It's very fluid. So we embarked on this program where we would work with the biologists to collect data, help them. But more importantly, I told them, I just need to report to our membership that the math and the model you're using is accurate or scientifically defensible, as I call it. So let's see this thing from soup to nuts. Let's see it start to finish. And if we don't agree on certain things, that's fine. But we need to see a process and a methodology that I can go and tell a trapper and say, look, they say there's 500 fishers because they say there's, 100 square kilometers with whatever density. And that's something that people can relate to. As the process unfolded, the government got into some rather elaborate modeling techniques. And if you do any research on it, it's called Bayesian modeling. It's a very academic exercise. But the biggest criticism you'll ever find on Bayesian modeling is the fact that you can have a predetermined outcome and you can take your data and push it to form a predetermined outcome. And we had the suspicion right out of the gate. So we retained a number of experts. We had Mark Boyce from the University of Alberta, who's a modeling expert, actually happened to be the mentor or the supervisor for one of the women in Victoria who was running the modeling. We had Tim Hiller out of, I think, Idaho, who's an ecologist. He guides us, helps us with quite a bit. And then we hired probably one of Canada's top global consulting firms, WSP Global. And we had two guys on there, Kyle Knopf and Morgan Skinner, who gave us a lot of oversight and were directing us whether the modeling was going correctly or not. We ended up in a situation where about July of last year, we started seeing problems with the modeling. We saw that the models weren't operating properly. We had concerns with some of the data. And at every turn, we basically shot down. Essentially, this is the way it is. And I'll give you a case in point. One of the study areas, I think, had 22 females and 3 males for data. And we said, well, that's doesn't happen in nature. Like, that's just seems wrong. And they said, well, it's the best data we have. So I took one of the fishers I had caught and tried to put it through one of their hair snaggers. And it was a medium male, did not fit in the hair snagger. So I said, right away, your bias is because you can't actually capture this animal. The government's response to that was, well, no. For every big one we miss a small one. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? Like, you catch squirrels, you catch weasels, you get martins, but you're going to skip a small fisher offset by a large fisher. And so when you see this bias in the data, you start questioning it. And there seemed to be no willingness to accommodate those biases. And so we had instances where we referred to the study where BC and Alberta did a joint fisher relocation project down into, I think, Washington and Oregon. And when you have an unencumbered trap, which these live traps that they were catching them in, the male to female ratio was 50-50. And I told them, I said, so you have an unencumbered capture mechanism where they don't have to force their head into anything. And you have 50-50, but you're telling us it's 22-3. Like, so I told them, you're missing 33% of your population, right? So these are sort of the things that we encountered along the way that I find very troubling. And it was almost felt to me that they went down this path and they were so committed to it, although it was an erroneous path, that they couldn't back out of it. And we, as the BCTA, offered to help fund, we had access to extra computational power through the universities, through Mark. We offered some financial assistance to make sure that this was done properly. And then the dialogue essentially ceased. And I'll give you one example that I found particularly troubling. When we started to realize that there were problems, they made a comment. We said, look, we're willing to offer the BCTA at its cost to supplement what you guys are doing. And the complex, that would be fantastic because, we're under-resourced. There was an interval where things really went sideways in August of last year. I think I reached out to 3 different people 9 times in a week and a half, and nobody from the government returned the calls. And that was unfortunately sort of the end of the project. We were then always had an agreement or an understanding that we would collaboratively work towards a model, one that we could critique from both sides. And again, in all fairness, it was always, if we didn't agree with it, nobody had a veto right, except maybe the government. So if we didn't like it, we could try to sway it, but we weren't going to say, we respectfully agree to disagree. How's that? So we ended up in a situation about 3 months ago where nothing seemed to happen. And all of a sudden we were told that, oh, we're happy to have a conversation with you regarding the CDC reassessment, but we can't give you the exact numbers. And I had a rather visceral reaction to that, I think, as did Glenn, which led to the letter that you guys saw. The agreement always was we would work with them on the preliminary model, and then we would work with them on the final model after we both had some toing and froing to see if there were adjustments to be made. And then that would be submitted to the CDC. And the government took upon itself to circumvent that entire process and make a submission and say, here's what we submitted. And that was not part of the deal. We actually had a charter to say that we'd work on it collaboratively. So I'm a pretty simple guy. I take people for face value. You tell me something, I believe you. I work in the mining business, finance. I deal with a lot of criminals. I think a lot of people that went to jail for what they do. And I've never been treated this way in any file I've ever worked on in my 30 years of banking. So, I was always told by everybody, don't trust the government. They're going to screw you. They're disingenuous. And unfortunately, they're right. And so it's been a very troubling experience. To be honest, I kind of lose my faith in humankind, or maybe it should be government. So we're in this position now where we're at a bit of a stalemate. We still don't know what was submitted. Tim is busy trying to find that. And I think when I have some subsequent dialogue, we'll try to get to the bottom of what was actually submitted. But I think at the end of the day, as all modeling, garbage in, garbage out. And I think that they don't have, in my opinion, they don't have a defensible model. And so,
Wow.
as of yesterday was the first dialogue I had with a WO Waterlands Resource Stewardship senior member. And I told her, look, we want to work together, but we can't work under the conditions we did in the past because it was disingenuous, it was duplicitous. And I would like to see us kickstart. If we have to start over. And she said, well, what's your timing? And to me, timing is nothing. I'm here. I'm going to fight this right till the end. I'm not going away because this is just, it's just wrong on so many fronts. So I have that determination. So we've agreed to have a conversation in the next 3 weeks. They're in the middle of budgets. I guess we've got this work action program that things have come to a grinding halt. And we're going to try to kick this off again and get some valid science and understand what's really going on.
Wow. That's a comprehensive story. Like man, I'm so impressed by what the association's done, what you've done. I mean, this is really true leadership. This is the front we're working on now. Like it's engaging scientists. It's about information and about collaboration. Like that's amazing. But you're still having these problems. So can you, I know somewhere in this process of the classification and the listing of Fisher, the populations got split in the province, and they created these two, like a sort of a northeastern and sort of subpopulations, which, as you know, if you've got 100 things and you draw a line and then separate the marbles, like your numbers become differently, and then you start talking about these two numbers, and of course, splitting species into subspecies and variants is an incredibly controversial area of zoology. There's the lumpers and then there's the splitters. We've had species of wildlife in different places of the world where they're just like, there's one species, then there's 12 subspecies, and then we're back to 2 species. And, the scientists are back and forth on it. But explain
Sure.
that, what the two, and how you feel that's impacted this numbers game that you've been talking about.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic comment. So first of all, we have what we call the Columbian fissure, and then we have what's called the boreal fissure. And apparently the Columbian fissure is unique to BC. Okay? The boreal fissure is through, Alberta, Saskatchewan, all the way to Maine, New York. I think they treat that all as such. Um, the Columbian fissure, interestingly enough, is now also being split into, I believe, 3 subgroups once again, which is just sort of staggering because the look, the whole point is if the Columbian fissure was the same as the boreal fissure, we probably wouldn't have this issue, right? Because it's the same critter. So by compartmentalizing it or creating a subspecies, you can take a population of 20,000 and say, wait a minute, there's only 500 of these here, so they have to be protected. If you look at some work that was done by Jamie Gorell, there was always an idea that the Vancouver Island wolverine was a distinct subspecies from the lower mainland wolverine or the mainland wolverine. And he disproved that using genetics. So in the last 5 to 10 years, I'll go back 20 years, there's been a lot of work done where you can delineate genetics and actually say if they're the same. But one of the important factors is you get what's called genetic drift. So if you keep animals apart, say you put a roadway through that nothing can cross, over thousands of years, those 2 species will drift apart genetically because they can't interbreed. So Jamie's always told me, look, one of the factors you have to look at is not just the genetics, but can these animals cross back and forth and interbreed? And then there's some kind of criteria of you need to have so many interbreeding, right? Because at some point they do drift apart. So I think for the Fisher fight, if you could get rid of the genetically defined subspecies, you wouldn't have a problem. And so this is a fight that we came to rather late, but Tim is busy with that. We have seen some of the genetic work. We've had a couple of geneticists sort of review it, and they believe that that's done questionable science. So this is an initiative we're just we're working on 2 fronts. We had to get a Freedom of Information Act from our partners who we work collaboratively with to get the data. And then our partners, rather than sending us the data in Excel and in a database format, send it to us in a PDF form. So we now have a student digitizing all of this data. I mean, how ludicrous is that? We're supposed to work together. You're making our lives very difficult. Another thing that came out of all this work is that in most provinces and most jurisdictions, if you put a paper out that's peer reviewed, you have to supply the raw data so people can actually review it. They're not giving us the data. So again, why is there mistrust? You're hiding something. Give it to us. Let us do the work, right? So there are a lot of questions about whether or not we really do have a distinct subspecies, and that's another fight or another component of the fight that we're angling in on now. And I think we have some information that suggests that's not accurate or not an accurate assessment. As a matter of fact, without saying names, the person who published the paper is a field biologist, not a geneticist. I mean, that's a very unique, specialized skill set, right? So, yeah, that's where we are on that front.
Is there, I think I might have recalled something from your presentation that, is there some trap lines in BC that kind of like got one subspecies on one side of the trap line and the other subspecies on the other side? Like, is there anybody that's got the dividing line between the 2 supposed subspecies?
Well, I haven't looked into that, but I'd be willing to bet that there would be, because we do know they cross over. And I think actually Glenn may have had a trap line where one of the major rivers does bifurcate it. And, intuitively you look at a river and you go, it's 50, 100 feet wide, but they do cross. Come breeding season, or if they get pushed out, animals are pretty resilient, right? Like they they go to great lengths to find a place to live. So
They can swim.
exactly. Exactly.
Cool.
Um,
Doug, oh, sorry, go ahead,
no,
Olav.
go ahead.
Doug, what are your thoughts? What questions you want to weigh in on?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, the thing that this brings to mind for me is our, kind of the Canadian trapping community's other big genetics fight about the so-called Algonquin wolf in Ontario, right? And I mean, at least there we can say, well, yeah, one is a wolf and one is a coyote. You just can't tell the difference between them looking at them. Still leads the government to put in place some, enormous draconian measures to protect the quote unquote Algonquin wolf. And I mean, and the official position of the government of Quebec is that the Algonquin wolf doesn't exist. This is, I think, one of those scenarios where, as you say, Olav, with modeling exercises, and I used to deal with this a lot when I still worked on fishery stuff, is garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have good data, it doesn't matter how good your model is. If you have bad data going into it, you will have bad outcomes coming out of it. And then there may well be problems in your model that you're not seeing because you're putting bad data into it. And, it's a little bit strange to me. And I will admit to having only training in the most dangerous science, political science, but the reality of looking at all of the fishers in North America are one species, except for this one subspecies that happens to occur in BC. And, what management objective is there for protecting what is ostensibly a separate subspecies? We see this in a lot of different species. I mean, you look at the white-tailed deer. Depending on who you ask, there's 27 subspecies of white-tailed deer, but realistically, the only one that's managed separately is cow's deer in southwestern U.S. and northern Mexico. It's for people that really like lumping and splitting, and I'm just thinking of my buddy Simon, who's probably going to listen to this, and he's frothing at the mouth because he is a lumper, and he has a whole lot of issues with splitters, and he actually has the scientific background to defend this stuff better than I do. But if there's functionally no difference between this population, whether it's a subpopulation or a population or a subspecies or a separate species, if there's functionally no difference, what is the intent of trying to protect it? And that's where some of these conversations really become academic. And it's like, okay, they are a separate subspecies. Not saying in this case the Columbian fishers are, but just in a vacuum, in a hypothetical, there is this thing that is a technically genetically distinct subspecies that in no way, shape, or form is different from the other animals in the broader species, other than particular genetics. How or why would we manage them separately or manage them differently than the broader population? And, we see in some cases the inverse of this problem in management of things like species at risk, where, Environment Canada is consulting on listing wolverine under a species of special concern under Species at Risk Act. And they're like, we are going to apply this to all wolverines in Canada. It's like, well, why? Or caribou managed, woodland caribou were managed and barren ground caribou separately. All barren ground caribou are managed under one species at risk listing. There are barren ground caribou in northern Quebec that will never ever interact genetically with barren ground caribou in the Western Arctic. It's physically impossible, but they're all being listed as one species at risk listing. So it's, when we get into the nexus of science and management, in a lot of ways, we need to understand what the management objectives are first. And then we can say, okay, well, here is what we are trying to conserve or trying to protect or trying to encourage. And then we say, okay, well, the science tells us X. And in order to meet our objectives with the science, here's what it says. The science may say we're meeting our objectives and we don't have to do anything. That's the best case scenario. But when we get into these like super arcane modeling and management exercises without loads of data, you need an enormous amount of data to actually underpin these kinds of management decisions in a responsible way. But like you say, if the hair snagger doesn't fit the animal that we're trying to manage here, like the most basic failures of data collection are evident here. And if you have basic failures of data collection without putting in place giant caveats through your entire process and saying, hey, we know we have this problem in data collection, so we are going to make an estimate based on, this other unencumbered capture exercise that says we're probably closer to a 50-50 split, but we're not actually using that data. We're using the more recent data, but we're using the older data to give us kind of a control. Whereas it seems like they just breezed by that and they were like, oh yeah, no, we're ignoring that and just saying for every big one we miss a small one. But we don't actually build in that increased population to the model.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I've seen is I've talked to a number of senior biologists who are now in their late 60s, early 70s here in the Lower Mainland. And they're of the school that fur management is the responsibility of the trappers. We have no interest in wiping out our populations. As a matter of fact, I think most of us volunteer our time to help them thrive. We have this group now in Victoria, and if I make a very general statement, we got a bunch of greenie PhDs who have lived on the island or live in Victoria, and they're dictating to the rest of the province how things should run. And I'll give you a couple of examples where we did a live trapping fisher exercise actually near my cabin in the Clinton area as part of the study. The biologist spent 3-4 days, couldn't catch one. We had 5 or 6 volunteers who put out bait piles at our own cost, set it all up for them. And they said, no, we're going to handle the trapping. And after 4 days, didn't catch one. I went in the very same day, fixed their live trap, bedded it down, made it solid. And 12 hours later, we had a fisher. And this was a fisher I'd seen on camera almost every day. Interesting. Here's some of the point. And this is the issues that I have. I called them and I said, guys, we've got a female fisher, bring the vet, do our tests and studies. The girls came and said, this is a small male. Now, if anyone who's a trapper, the difference between a male, female fisher, it's orders of magnitude, 2 to 3 times the size for a male versus a female. And I'm arguing with them. And sure enough, the vet goes and says, hey, this is a female. Of course, because we've seen them. Another part came out, the one biologist who's been working for the BC government, live trapping these fishers for 5 years, has never seen a fisher in the wild other than one they caught. And she went out with one of our trappers near 100 Mile and was so excited that she had seen her first unencumbered free fisher in all her years of study. And we see them all the time. So again, this is this disparity between being in an office in Victoria and actually being boots on the ground and understanding what's happening on the landscape. I think another criticism I have is a lot of these biologists seem to be more focused on academic scientific research than they are in actually solving a problem or practically applying something. And Mark, it's to your comment, fisher excluder boxes. I started out right out of the gate. I made all of mine with excluder plates. And I did an article in the Trapper magazine making a bunch of suggestions how those boxes should be changed. For example, the side slots were 1 inch, 1.25 inches. I've had fishers reach in with a paw and get caught, and then they're hanging, which is just the cruelest thing that could happen. I've videoed them how they rip those excluder plates off. When you have the split horizontally, they grab it and they pry it off. So with a couple of very simple tweaks, make the splits vertical. Put your plates on vertically, then they can't peel them off. This is assuming you have a horizontally mounted box. Make the slits 3/4 of an inch or 5/8. Glenn did the last batch that way. And here's the comment we get from the biologist. No, but in order to keep my data consistent, I need you to keep using those boxes that we designed. And I said, yeah, you guys designed the boxes, but is this to get data or is this to try to catch or prevent the incidental capture of fishers? And I think that to me was a very telling comment of what the thinking is. No, I want to do a research paper. That's my priority where ours is. Let's not catch a fisher in bycatch.
Interesting. Yeah, we all talk about adaptive management, which is, you plan, you do something, you take a look at what you're doing, you adjust, and you go through that. There's a difference between, like an academic exercise unto itself, which has value. It contributes knowledge, it's kind of got to hold all the variables steady through the study. But then the real world is we've got to be trying to put this stuff into play and adjusting to, the changing, unpredictable natural world out there. That's the reality of adaptive management. So that's frustrating. I see this in hunting in British Columbia, and the work that I do with Wild Origins, Canada, it's national in scope. So I'm keeping, on the pulse of different things, and just looking at trapping and hunting with our nearest neighbor, Alberta and British Columbia. British Columbia in hunting, and I think in trapping, has a general ethos within the government, which is to subtract, take away. Alberta is the complete opposite. Where can we add? Where can we give back to Albertans? If the data says this lake, the walleye are doing well, and fishers can go from a daily bag limit of 2 to 3, they're going to give that back to people because those fish belong to the people of the province of Alberta. They can put an extra grouse on the plate. If an extra moose permit can come out of an area and feed a family, they're about giving back. They're about creating opportunity for kids, for houndsmen. BC is about subtracting. So I think, the things I'm hearing from you, which is they're justifying a means to say we need to take away. Yep. Got full support right to the top on that, as opposed to looking at it from the lens going, okay, we need to kind of understand if this fisher populations are different, what they're doing, whatever, but let's do it in a way that maintains, trapper opportunity. If we, in a 5-year, if we see this level of, catch down to here, oh, okay, then everybody says that's probably, trappers need to back off, or maybe they're having an impact. But let's use this adaptive thing. Let's give back to trappers, maintain. I see it in hunting. It's sort of like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if, new hunters and young kids could hunt squirrels in the province? There isn't a place in this province where you can step off of a road and see a red squirrel. I mean, a new hunter, you get 6 of them, you can make a squirrel stew. They're great. I've done it. And it's like, no. But you're like, hey, this area up here, like, why don't we cut the number of moose tags by 50%? Ah, good idea.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, we saw it in Alberta last year. It was like they lifted quotas on fishers, and trappers were like, thank God, because my fisher population is hammering the heck out of my marten population. If we want to talk about biodiversity conservation, we also have to talk about the number of species, but we also have to talk about these species having representative population sizes. Not this. This is not biodiversity. This is biodiversity. Trappers can play a role by bringing their fishers down, allowing the marten to come up. So that was a give back, but it was also a conservation tool. Where British Columbia, what I'm hearing from you is they're widgering everything down so that they can take, fishers away from trappers. So it's a philosophical thing that comes right from the highest levels in an organization, private sector or public sector, and then that gets reverberated down to what you're saying. Field biologists are justifying things because the general ethos is we kind of think there's something going on here that we've got to take away from the trappers, as opposed to like, man, we're doing everything we can for you guys to give you a fisher trapping season back. Like, work with us here. We're trying to make sure that this is sustainable. That's not the ethos in BC. So.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and it's a very interesting. I like the comment, the splitters and the lumpers, and that's a new term for me to to use. But I agree that there seems to be a very large shift. I think in BC, I've looked at a lot of the bios of of the people in senior positions, who the decision makers of the CDC, and you look at their backgrounds, they're from the islands off of Vancouver, and they've spent their whole time volunteering for land conservation. And it's, there's land conservation for the conservation of distinct and important grasslands, but there's also, like you said, this ethos of, no, we shouldn't be trapping, we shouldn't be harvesting, we should let everything remain as it is, which is not management. And I have a number of guys that are pretty frustrated on their lines because all they do is catch fishers. And, for those who are not familiar with this, we have to turn our fishers in. We have to go to a compulsory inspector. Now, I happen to live in the Lower Mainland. My trap line's 5 hours away. Well, I'm not going to drive 3 kilometers east to go drop a fisher off and hope I can find an inspector who will inspect it on some time frame. So I take my fisher, I drive him 400 kilometers home. Then I drive him out to Surrey for 2 hours, get him inspected, and then I have to turn him in. So I have to go back home for an hour and a half and find a place to turn it in, another 2 hours. So we also have this system that is so onerous.
You don't have a mail-in option.
I probably should, right? So
how's that climate friendly?
Yeah.
Like you're burning all this gas up, right? Like, should you just?
So they make it honest, and really at the end of the day, if you think about it, if the government's going to be in receipt of this fisher, why do we have to go through compulsory inspection? Because all we're standing there is waiting for a guy to fill out an hour of paperwork. Why can't we just bring it to the COs and say, here, I caught it. Here's where I caught him.
Excellent.
Here's my trap line. Done. So we have this onerous process that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I guess that's part of it, to get just people sort of like the gun control stuff going, God, this is just too much paperwork. I'm done with it, right? So a couple years ago, so for folks not in British Columbia, so there is an organization in British Columbia that's at arm's length from the government. It's a watchdog paid for by government, but its mandate is arm's length, called the Forest Practices Board. So their mandate is to audit what happens in the forest industry. And basically, in an audit, are they following the laws? And I know a couple of years ago, they looked at a fisher management, because there is rules in BC for forestry logging activities of, if you're in known fisher habitat, these are the things that you're supposed to be doing as far as, patchwork, opening size, coarse woody debris, all of these things. And the number came up. The Forest Practices Board said, hey, we're going to do an audit. It takes them like a long time, like a year or more. Maybe speak a little bit to, if you can remember off the top of your head, because I think that's getting 3-4 years out now, what kind of you guys learned from that? Because that sort of is talking about the habitat piece, how the government, through its government logging operations and how its Crown issued tenures, are protecting and managing fisher habitat.
Yeah, so I'm not really completely up to speed on it, but I have seen the presentations of leaving piles of coarse woody debris. Essentially, for those who don't know, it's a burn pile that you don't burn, and your fisher can run in there and hide out and rest, et cetera, et cetera. I think some of the problems that I have seen at times is they look for what they call denning trees, and they cut every tree within 100 meters of it and leave the denning tree up by itself, which means it's no longer a denning tree. So I think, look, the logging is probably the greatest habitat destruction, I think, for fishers. But there's also a number of models that I think are wrong. And so one of the things we discovered with our fisher work was the original estimates were done on what they called an open air analysis. And if you deplete the canopy in a cut block or a certain area by 20%, the fisher will leave. Okay, so and I think that's probably a relatively scientifically proven. I think there's enough data to support that. What the government did is they spun that around and said, if you have natural habitat that has got less than 20 or that has lost 20% of its cover, there are no fishers there, which is a very different argument, right? So one is you're changing the habitat and a fisher leaves. Another is saying, well, because you don't have 80% cover, you don't have fishers. And so my trap line, for example, 63% logged, another 7-8% kind of ranch land, farms. And yet I have this abundance of fishers. Like I actually call it an infestation. It's a point where I'm scared to even put a 330 out because I'm going to catch a fisher. So, you see there is the movement to, I think, get the forestry guys to adapt to help protect fisher and provide more habitat. But having said that, we've talked to the biologists. I see it. We have fishers on grasslands all over BC. Like they're not scared to go out into the open. They're a pretty tenacious little animal. And so I don't think that the government has a very good idea of what is deemed suitable fisher habitat, which I think is another big
Right.
part of the problem.
So I found one of the articles. So there was a fisher audit done in the Kettle River area, which is sort of surprising because it's quite a dry area. But this one was from up in the Quesnel area, so more central British Columbia. And the pieces are coming back to me now because I've covered this story before. So it was trappers on a licensed trap line that raised the red flag to say the forestry operations are not following the fisher habitat rules laid out by the government. They contacted the Forest Practices Board, which initiated an audit in the Nasgo area west of Quesnel. The Forest Practices Board found that that logging operations were negatively impacting fisher habitat. So the rules were not being followed as far as managing fisher habitat in known habitat area west of the Quesnel area. So that's kind of in the heart of what you were saying is they say is the Columbia subspecies of the fisher, right? The Quesnel area. So, I mean, there you go. Like, I mean, it doesn't matter what you do with modeling, what trappers do. They have no control over what happens on a massive scale to the habitat. And, there's the watchdog actually, said the government isn't doing a proper job in that management area.
I think that's probably one of the biggest criticisms I hear from our membership throughout BC is this whole self-regulation or self-policing of logging practices. And everyone's now a professional forester, and they rely on contractors to do the harvest. And I think there's probably a bit of a disconnect between the guy who's buying the timber on his lease or from his own lease and having it contracted out. So it comes back to, I think, a comment I made earlier. We truly are stewards of the land. Like, who else is policing this? Like, trappers are out there all the time. We see it through the summer. We're there in the fall and the winter. We have very intimate knowledge of what's going on. And when we see these things, it appears to me a lot of times it's, well, you're just a dumb trapper. Like, you guys know what you're talking about. And yet we are the eyes and ears of the land. We see it. And I think, we had this issue with the glycol spraying. There was very first AGM I went to where somebody said, wait a minute, they told you they did this, but I saw this. And it was multiples of what they said. And so, again, a lack of oversight, which probably comes down to a lack of resources within our government and trying to farm everything out to contractors as opposed to just actually taking responsibility for best practices and the environment internally.
Yeah. Yeah. What parting messages do you want to leave for, the membership listening here, across Canada people might be going, geez, kind of sounds like X in Nova Scotia or Y in the Northwest Territories, right? You guys are taking a very rigorous approach, and trying to be in this collaborative data sharing model, engaging scientists. What are your messages to those folks? What or where should they be heading? With trying to be collaborative with their governments? What are your lessons learned?
I think my lessons learned is never give up.
Okay,
We
that's awesome.
we look, we're all in this together, and if we don't take this on, we'll just get steamrolled, right? So, as much as we have distrust, I think if we keep the faith, keep working together, we got to stay unified, and I think we have to just keep pushing back, just keep fighting for what we think is right. And for me, a lot of this just comes down to simple government governance, like, are you doing the right thing with the right data? And don't hide behind stuff. Be transparent. And so, I do want to put a shout out to a lot of the BCTA members, particularly the guys in the Caribou Chilcotin who, selflessly donated hundreds, thousands of hours to help. Okay, we've hit a bump in the road. It's, what they say, storming, norming, forming, right? So uh,
Right.
we just came through the storming part. Unfortunately, it was 2 years of just grief and agony. But I do want to leave everybody with this positive comment that there has been an outreach by the government, which just happened yesterday. We're going to start over. And interestingly enough, the dialogue that was sent, every single government official, with the exception of one, and the government had 10 or 12, were deleted on the email except for 2 or 3 people. And I outlined my concerns as a practical solution. And so I think we're going to start over. And I think, as BC trappers, I've told the government, we should be your data collectors. Like, we can do it for 1/1000th of the cost. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, I'm not going to pivot too much, but we're doing this tissue bank program. We're going to collect DNA samples from every critter in the province, and it's the BC trappers who are going to provide those because we can do it cost effectively. And I just tell our membership, keep the faith. This is not an overnight fight. This could be a 5-10 year fight. I got at least 10 years left in me, so we're going to I think we're going to resolve this.
Good, great message. Doug, you must be really proud what the BCTA is doing on this. This is textbook, really, right? We can't approach these things and think that we're not going to have problems. It's, people trying to blend, together and stuff. So yeah, as Olav said, there's a bump, hiccup, but it's looking positive. How do you approach something like this? Because like FIC, so Canada-wide, big issues, Ottawa stuff, international stuff, and at the grassroots level, you got people like Olav that are Olav that are
You didn't watch the movie Frozen.
No, my kids are too old for that.
Mark. Go watch Frozen.
But yeah, like he's right down there. The membership is down there in the details, way more than what you could ever do. But you've got a role to play nationally, internationally. How's the FIC and the BCTA like working together, roles and responsibilities on this specific issue in BC with the Fisher?
Yeah, with the Fisher issue, and similarly did to kind of any provincial or regional scale issue for provincial trappers associations, and for folks who are listening from Provincial Trappers Association or Trappers Locals that are FIC members, we're always available as a resource of hey, we've got this government issue. How should we approach this? How would you advise that we deal with this? I'm always happy to have a chat with folks from provincial associations and either provide advice or, one thing that I can say from my time working in a premier's office in Manitoba was like the thing that scares, provincial decision makers or territorial decision makers the most is when they get a letter from their provincial association, and then there's another letter that comes in from a national or international body saying, we are concerned about how you were handling this issue. As per the letter dated September 18th from the BCTA, we have, concerns about how you're handling the Fisher issue, something like that. That's where the FIC really can just be an amplifier for some of these things. And, we can provide, we work closely with the provincial governments and territorial governments are all FIC members as well. So sometimes we have the ability to be, kind of a neutral messenger between and say, hey, BC government, we're hearing this from BCTA. We think there might be just a flow of information issue or something like that. How can we facilitate this getting dealt with? And, we are unique in a lot of ways at the FIC in that governments are at the table at the FIC. They are FIC members as much as trappers associations are. Not that means that we're going to take, government side by any means. We're going to say, hey, there's concerns here. There's real issue here. What the FIC wants to see is to see this get dealt with to the satisfaction of trappers and to make sure that we have the best information out there informing trapping management. And, but we can play that facilitator role and have at times played that facilitator role in other provinces and just said like, hey, let's have a conversation between me and the provincial rep and the provincial trapper association rep. And like, let's the three of us have a conversation about this. And, let's pull it outside of kind of, here's the 68 people CC'd on an email. Let's just have a conversation. And, that's where we can provide, provide a helping hand, at least. I'm not going to say FIC is going to solve problems always, but, we can help make sure that concerns are heard and we can, share our own concerns as FIC. Because we do have a mandate, not only for trap testing and certification, but we have a mandate for bear conservation and sustainable management for bear populations. So, for folks that are listening out there that you're sitting there going, wait, my association has a really similar issue to this. Don't hesitate to reach out to me at FIC. The other thing that we can do as FIC is say, hey, this issue you're dealing with is really similar to the Fisher issue they're dealing with in BC. I'm going to connect you with Olav and you guys can have a conversation about how you can deal with this. And, the FIC can act as nothing else as a go-between between the different associations and help provide connections between trappers associations in different parts of the country.
Yeah. Now, in something like this with the species listings, Olav was talking about sort of like CDC Conservation Data Center red listing. That's a provincial species ranking model. This has the ability at some point in the future to move up federally to the Species at Risk Act for listing and designation there. So there must be a role there from provincial conversations to you being in Ottawa to be able to talk on behalf of the issue if it starts to move towards something like a Sarah listing. So I think you've done that with the Wolverine. You talked about that, kind of like embedded there. Has any of this with the Fisher gone that far yet to the national Sarah discussion?
I certainly haven't seen it. I stand ready to be corrected by Olav. I haven't seen this really start to ratchet up through Kasiwik. The other thing is that the Sarah process is incredibly slow. A recommendation will come from Kasiwik. Kasiwik is who knows acronyms better than me? Committee on Wildlife.
Committee on the endangered status of wildlife in Canada.
Yeah, so like something will come up from Kasiwik. Good job, Mark. You win the bonus points for today. I just came back from a week on vacation, so I got to relearn acronyms. We'll see something come out from Kasiwik. It might not get moved on by government for 10 years after the fact.
Yeah.
And we deal with this. We dealt with this on Wolverine. We're dealing with this on ringed seal right now. Going to DFO or ECCC, depending on whether it's a aquatic species or not, and saying like, hey, there's 10 years of science since Kasiwik made their recommendation. More often than not, our number one recommendation to government is to go back to Kasiwik and say, hey, go back to Kasiwik and get an updated opinion about what you're putting forward, because there's so much more science that's come out on this in the last however many years since they made their recommendation that actually maybe they don't agree with their recommendation anymore.
So Mark,
Yeah.
on the Kosiwik front, and this is something I didn't delve into too much, but Tim spent a lot of time on. There is a difference between, I guess, a stricter, more rigorous criteria at Kosiwik than there is at CDC. And my understanding in the Fisher issue, and this is work that Tim did, the CDC standard does not meet the Kosiwik standard. And if this was done to a Kosiwik standard, we probably wouldn't be in the position we're in.
Interesting. Yeah.
So
Another barrier in conservation, man. This has been a huge eye-opening conversation, and I also think it's been an inspiring conversation to see what you're doing, Olav. Like it's amazing, and I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. I want to thank you for the time to come on the show to explain this, and I want to reach out and say thank you to the BC Trappers Association for allowing you to come on the show and represent the membership to discuss this topic and what you're doing as an association. So thanks across the board. Look forward to seeing what the next chapter holds in maybe getting to that model, that collaborative model, data sharing, data collection, by trappers, bringing in those efficiencies and looking for those win-wins. We still have the bigger philosophy and ethos of getting into a add back rather than take away
yes.
type philosophy. But I think that takes all of us working on that from an evidence-based perspective to show why something can either stay or be added, as opposed to just being, well, we have to take away because we don't really know, or this one thing says something, so we got to take away. That I think that's a general mindset that I think you're leading the way on changing, even though it's just Fisher. Your bigger issue I see you tackling is this subtract versus add or status quo until we know better. So congratulations on that. I think you're going to benefit the framework across the spectrum of fish, wildlife, and habitat in the province by what you're doing here. I really see this as like a landmark case, so an example case study. So good work. Thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And thanks, folks, for listening. If you got an issue like this and you want to come on the show and tell the country what's happening, reach out to myself or Doug or through the show, and we'll get something set up. It's exactly how this interview, this conversation with Olav came up. Was he reached out? So definitely are interested in sharing these stories. So you're not just listening to Doug and I drone on about what's going on in the news. So this is exciting. This is a real learning opportunity for myself and for everybody. So thanks, folks, and we'll see you in the next episode.